Here's a brief history of the evolution of the zodiacs. And I'm going to offer an answer to the question of why India uses a sidereal zodiac in spite of having tropical definitions for it. Let's start at the start. Let's go back to the ancient cultures of Kali Yuga. Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Chinese, and the remnants of Vedic culture in India. All of these ancient cultures primarily used stars as the reference points for their astrological observations and divinations. Yet, all of them also had calendars based on a 360-day idealized solar cycle, divided into 12 idealized lunar cycles of 30 days each, or something very close to that. So, all of these ancient cultures, in addition to their stellar astrological and astronomical observations, they also had this idealized division of the ecliptic into 12 equal segments. But these ancient cultures didn't use that 12-fold zodiacal division for their astrological divination nearly as much as they used simple observation of the stars. So, first question is, why not? And the answer is because they couldn't use the 12-fold divisions because it's difficult to calculate these things. Now we're talking about 6,000 or 5,000 years ago when our records of astrological developments begin. At that time, they were able to keep track of the sun's position in the 12 divisions because that's fairly easy to track by tracking shadow and by tracking the length of a day or a night. But they weren't able to track the positions of other planets because they just didn't have the mathematical ability for it, nor did they have the observational ability. But on the other hand, anybody can go out at night and look up at the sky. And it's very easy to do that, doesn't require any math. And the observations can be very simple. So this is why the earliest records of astrological stuff going on in these old cultures is divinations or predictions where it's omen reading, where the omens are stellar. So, for example, you have something like, there's a halo around the moon, and that's why there's a plague, or a star fell out of the sky, and that's why these invaders came to our country. Now, over millennia, as these ancient cultures became more and more sophisticated in their sciences, they developed more and more elaborate mathematical tools and more accurate observational tools. Their sidereal observations became more abstract. And instead of just literally something happening in the sky that you could see, they would draw constellations which weren't observational. They were just symbolic or figurative, and they would draw boundaries in the sky based around those constellations. And they would, begin more estimating things rather than direct observation. But it was still sidereal. And so you'll see all of these ancient cultures that I mentioned, they had sidereal divisions. In other words, constellations that were important to their divination methods. The Egyptians had 36. The Babylonians had 18. The Chinese and the Vedic had 28. But also, as you get to about 2,000 years ago, the improvements in the maths and the sciences started to make the 12-fold division, the solar division, more usable. So they started to be able to predict or forecast where a planet would be at a certain point in time. So even if you couldn't see it, like if it was in the daytime sky, you could know where it was. And so they started to be able to calculate where planets were in reference to the solar divisions, the 12 divisions of the sun's path, the ecliptic. So this is why around 2,000 years ago, we start to find records, especially in Mesopotamia, of astrologers beginning to use a 12-fold equal division system for divination. Now let's talk a little bit about the nature of this 12-fold division. The measurement of it had always been done by measuring daylight versus nighttime, or shadow, length of a shadow versus light, right? Because it's inherently what it is a division of the sun's movement around the earth, apparent movement around the earth. So you're going to measure it by the stuff that comes from the sun, light. In the Indian tradition, you find these definitions preserved really well, which is why it's confusing, why they use a sidereal zodiac system. But for example, in the Surya Siddhanta, 14th chapter, 7th text, in the next couple of verses, very clearly talks about how these 12 divisions are based on the sun's position relative to the equator, which causes the days and nights to expand and contract. Same things are repeated in the Puranas like Vishnu Purana, Bhagavatam. Bhagavatam reference you can look up is 5:21:3, and the verses after that. So it's very clear even in India that the way of measuring these 12 equal-sized divisions was by the sun's movement north and south of the equator, generating greater or lesser daylight and night, or longer or shorter shadows. So this is why this 12-fold division is tropical by its soul, its constitution, its very nature is tropical, because tropos means turning, and tropos means going north of the equator and turning around and coming back down south, and then turning around and going back up north. And that turning motion of the sun in reference to the equator is why things are called tropical. So those 12-fold divisions are tropical by their nature. But the astrological traditions that had been developing for millennia, we could say about 4 millennia, were sidereal in practice. And in nature, they were looking at stars and observing stars. You see, stars in Latin pertaining to star in Latin means sidere, siderias, and now we have the word sidereal. So sidereal means stellar. That's what it means, and tropical means equatorial, turning around the equator. So the 12-fold divisions are tropical in nature, and the other divisions that various cultures had in different ways were stellar in nature. But the problem is the momentum from astrology, from the culture of astrology, was sidereal. But then they brought in these 12 divisions. So naturally, as they began using these 12-fold divisions, they wanted to correlate them to their existing library of divinations, and they wanted to correlate them to their existing manner of looking at things, and they wanted to correlate them to the things that they had already been working with, the stars. So what they initially did was they said, now we know how to use these 12 divisions, and let's calculate where they are amongst the stars. So they made a stellar map of the 12 divisions. In Babylon or Mesopotamia, it seems that what happened was the 18 divisions that they had, the 18 stellar sidereal divisions that they had, morphed into 12. And some of the names and things from the 18 persisted into the 12. Elsewhere, it seems more like they just layered them on top of each other. And in India, they modified from 28 to 27 and standardized them in sizes that would match with the 12 divisions. In different ways, different cultures took these 12 divisions and married them with their sidereal divisions. So there's a marriage of the tropical calculation with the sidereal calculation, but at that time, nobody was really aware that there was a difference. And that's why they wanted to say, let's take these 12 divisions and map them onto the stars, because we're used to looking at the stars. But around 2,000 years ago, a little bit before that, the person credited with discovering the difference between tropical and sidereal measurements is known as Hipparchus. And he's the one who said, look, the 12-fold divisions, which are based on the sun's movement north and south of the equator, the calculations the coordinates that you arrive at from that calculation is not staying in sync with the stars that you observe and that you place them at. So if you correlate the sun's position when it comes over the equator in reference to a star on 1 year, and then you go back several years later, it will be slightly different. And if you go back more and more, the longer you take to go back and look and see if the sun is still at that same point, still with that same star on the day when it comes over the equator, the more you find it isn't, and it's drifting consistently away. That was his discovery. We call this discovery the precession of equinoxes. So this happened about a little more than 2,000 years ago, right around the time that the 12-fold zodiac started becoming popular. As in fact, because the 12-fold zodiac became popular and mapped to the stars, then Hipparchus realized it can't be permanently mapped to the stars because it's going to drift in relationship to the stars. So at that time, the astrological culture said, well, this is the 12-fold thing is a tropical thing by nature, so let's adopt a purely tropical definition of it. And we're not going to map it to stars anymore, just map it to the equinoxes and the solstices. There was some resistance to that, and it did take a few centuries before the vast majority of people converted to that system. It seems by the evidence that by about 1600 years ago, practically everyone had accepted a purely tropical definition of the 12-fold zodiac. However, there's a big exception to that rule. The whole subcontinent of India. This country never adopted a purely tropical zodiac, even though they defined the zodiac tropically, as everybody does. Based on the sun's movement north and south of the equator, they defined their 12 divisions. They never went with the rest of the community, the astrological community, towards a purely tropical definition. They kept it mapped to their stars. Now let's address the question of why. Why did they do that? Somebody might say, because they're dumb. But that's not the right answer, because they're not dumb. They're brilliant. And somebody might say, well, it was a mistake. But I doubt that that's the right answer either. Because they do know that the zodiac is tropical in its nature, but they're just refusing to use it that way. They're insisting on using it sidereally. And they will calculate things tropically when necessary, because it's actually impossible to even accurately calculate a horoscope without tropical calculations. So tropical zodiac has to be understood and has to be used in any system, even a sidereal system, just to make the calculations. But in the sidereal system, then they'll just translate everything over to sidereal and interpret that. And they have this in India. They developed the word Ayanamsha, which is so popular, and everybody uses it throughout the world. Even people who don't even know that it's Indian say Ayanamsha, and that word means the difference between the tropical Aries 0 and the sidereal Aries 0, or the difference between tropical Aries 0, which means the ascending equinox, and some other stellar thing. That's an Ayanamsha. So they obviously know about the difference between the tropical and the sidereal 12-fold zodiac. So it wasn't like they didn't know about the precession of equinoxes or they made a mistake. They knew what they were doing. They did it on purpose. Classical India seems to have purposely chosen a sidereal zodiac. And so again, we have this question on why. Why did they do that? So my theory on this is that if we go back further to ancient India, you'll find that they had developed an extensive system of astrology, and it was quite possibly more elaborate and mathematically advanced than the systems that are in Babylonia and Egypt. And the thing about the Vedic system, the Vedic sidereal system of nakshatras, is that it is inexorably tied to their much more important culture of spiritual and religious life, because it's used to time their ceremonies and rituals. So it can't be messed with without messing with their whole religious and spiritual culture. So this is why they didn't just erase their original divisions, sidereal divisions, and adopt the 12-fold zodiac. They slightly modified their nakshatra system to make it fit into the 12. And then by doing that, what they had accomplished was quite compelling and well organized and quite beautiful, really. There was harmony with the edges of the fire and water signs, which we call Gandantas in India. There was 108 total navamshas overlaying the 27 nakshatras, creating a concept of navamshas being synonymous with the 4 quarters of a nakshatra, which is where this concept became minted. So by taking their nakshatra system and putting it into the 12-fold zodiac system and using both of them for interpretation, they came up with something pretty compelling. And then they developed systems and theories of interpretation based on that, which is why today you have a lot of the talk about nakshatra padas and who's the ruler of this nakshatra pada and this, that, and it's all related. It's all mixed up between navamshas and nakshatras and rashis and nakshatras, and everything's mixed up. That must have started quite early. And they must have been unwilling to give up that. It's compelling, it's nice, it's beautiful, it fits together so good. You see the same thing today. If you bring up the topic of a tropical zodiac to an Indian astrologer, a practitioner of Indian astrology, their biggest complaint is, but how can it be? It ruins the whole synergy. It ruins the whole symmetry of how the nakshatras are aligned with the rashis. It's the same argument that you have today is most likely the argument that you had 2,000 years ago. So they simply resisted. The rest of the world wasn't really caring too much about their old sidereal systems and was more interested in using this 12-fold system. So they just went with this fairly radically new way of doing things, which all the previous thousands of years had been sidereal-based observation, and then this tropical 12-fold thing comes along. But the rest of the world went along with that. But India said, but we like our old system, and we'll take this 12-fold thing and incorporate it into that. Actually, I found reference to this dynamic in some of the Sanskrit texts themselves. For example, several hundred years after Hipparchus, about 1,500 years ago, there was a great Indian mathematician and astrologer named Varahamihira. And he noted this same problem. He wrote, for example, in Brihat Samhita, chapter 3, right in the first 3 texts, he said that the northern solstice, which we call the summer solstice, it used to be in Ashlesha, he said, but now it's not. So you have to make observations about the actual location of the solstice if you want to know where the signs like Cancer and Capricorn are. And in Panch Siddhantika, that's another one of his important books. This one is more mathematical in nature. He, in the 3rd chapter, text 21 and then 32, in those 2 texts, he explains, again, that the equinoxes and the solstices, they move through the nakshatras. And so he said that's why to correlate the nakshatra and the equinoctial point, you have to constantly correct it. You have to constantly update it. But he said that people don't do that, referring to the people of his time. And he said they just follow tradition. They just follow the previously established definition of the correlation. They're not updating it. So he seems to have noted this reluctance, in spite of knowledge or awareness that things should be updated, a reluctance to do that in preference of staying with the tradition. Now, it wasn't really a big, alarming, critical problem at the time, because for centuries after Hipparchus, the difference between a tropical 12-fold zodiac and a sidereal 12-fold zodiac was small, in many cases smaller even than the margin of error inherent in the nature of the mathematical calculations at the time. So it's quite small. So why sacrifice our whole system just for this theoretical difference of a few degrees? But as the millennia have passed, the difference between the tropical and sidereal concept of a zodiac has become dramatic. It's about 24 degrees now. So really, it's only now that this issue is becoming unavoidable, an alarming issue that has to be dealt with. The issue of whether or not you can really stick with a sidereal definition of the 12-fold zodiac, which is inherently tropical. Now, to their great credit, throughout all these millennia, the astrologers in India have certainly managed to be at least as accurate and relevant as the astrologers elsewhere, which may not be saying much, unfortunately, but it does say that at least their system, they're not worse than the other astrologers, but that's mainly because India has maintained a much more consistent interest in and support of astrological art. In other countries, it went through a lot of persecution and therefore became difficult to study. The problem, though, is that as the sidereal and tropical zodiacs become further and further divergent, to maintain that accuracy within a sidereal system is by no means impossible, but will require reworking and redefinition of fundamental concepts and definitions of things like planets and signs and what do they represent and why. And so what you're going to get is the fundamental symbols of astrology, planet signs, houses, are going to move further and further from their natural meanings, natural symbolisms, and rational symbolisms to more pragmatic things that just work when you do it this way. So it's not impossible to keep a sidereal system going indefinitely, but you'll have to keep adjusting and updating the core definitions. So rather than doing that, in the 21st century and even in the 20th century, there's been a growing number of astrologers, both ethnically Indian and not ethnically Indian, so like including myself, who are practicing Indian astrology, but doing so with a purely tropical 12-fold zodiac and a purely sidereal 27-fold nakshatra system. So this is a new option, and that's currently a current development in the astrological world. So I hope this video has helped you conceptualize and make sense out of the discussion and the facts and what you probably want to do about it and what you want to decide about how you want to do your astrology or how you want to have your astrology read to you. You can certainly get great readings from Indian astrologers using a sidereal system because they have their system. And you could certainly get great readings from Indian astrologers using tropical system as well as from Western astrologers using tropical system. But the reason why I've changed to the tropical system is because it's more rational, reasonable, and natural. By using a tropical definition of the zodiac, you can then make your definition of the fundamental components of astrology very clear, simple, and straightforward. And that doesn't need to be a lot of fuzziness around the edges. And I prefer that. Thank you very much. Thank you.